Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this Bruegel event on sustainable transitions. I'm Heather Graby, Senior Fellow here at Bruegel. We have people in the room. We're also live streaming this event. And I'm very pleased to welcome a really fantastic and interesting panel of researchers, including also Catherine Fieschi online, as well as those you can see in the room. We have an opportunity today to talk about a range of empirical work on attitudes towards the climate transition and essentially what would sustain it politically over a very long period. We're going to start with a presentation of the research that was presented in the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development's Transition Report this year, which is called Transitions Large and Small. And the small transitions refers to work on individual behavioral change and transitions within society. And I think this is a fantastic bridge for the EBRD to have done this study between the experience of the transition which the EBRD was set up to support in Central and Eastern Europe after the fall of communism. And that was largely in the 1990s, and of course a number of, most of those countries then joined the European Union in 2004 and 2007. To compare that and to think about what are the lessons of that for the forthcoming climate transition. And in both cases, it was a whole of society, whole of economy transition in which all of government was involved and every person was affected. That will also be the case with the climate transition. But the big difference is, at that point in time, the previous regime, the previous economy, the previous model of economy and society were discredited, and there was no question in anybody's mind that change had to come. Whereas with the climate transition, there are now calls among some even European politicians to hit the pause button, that somehow we can take a break from the climate transition. So the feeling of inevitability and the predictability of policy are perhaps more in question now than they were before. So we'll talk a bit about how that affects also public attitudes. What I think is also a very interesting parallel is that what people had in Central and Eastern Europe during post-communist transition was a sense that they were moving towards an economic model that they could see. They were moving towards a capitalist economy of the kind that they could see in West Germany or in, for example, Denmark. And that vision of what it might be like to live with West European levels of economic prosperity was an important motivating factor which maintained support for difficult and often painful economic reforms in the 1990s. Unfortunately, we don't have those circumstances when it comes to the climate transition. It's going to change most of the economy, but nobody can yet see what it will be like to live at net zero. There isn't yet a real existing net zero economy on the planet that you can point to and say, well, this is how you're going to live in future. Look, actually, quality of life could be better. It's largely an unknown scenario for most of the population. And this is a very tricky issue when it comes to motivating both the large scale and also the individual scale behavioral changes that would be necessary to move towards sustainable net zero. So we'll talk about these range of issues, but I'd like to start today with a presentation by Beata Jaworczyk, who's the chief economist at the EBRD, and of course was responsible for the report that the EBRD put out. And then we will have a very interesting panel of four researchers in different parts of the field to talk about their own research and also perspectives on the report. So first of all, over to you, Beata.
Thank you very much. If I may get the clicker. Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be back. It's a pleasure to present a snapshot of the report to you. The title of the report, Transitions Big and Small, reflect the content very well. The report is about big structural changes happening in the world, in the global economy, starting with the green transition, which necessitates the scramble for critical raw materials, both happening against the backdrop of geopolitical tensions. And these big aggregate transitions affect people's lives in a plethora of ways through necessitating job or career changes, through necessitating changes to housing, and in turn translating into different levels of life satisfaction and health. So in this very short presentation, I'm going to focus on small transitions to set the stage for our discussion. Now, I mentioned career changes, right? The moving from today to the net zero future will result in big changes to the structure of the economy. So in the report, we take a look at how many of those changes have already happened and how these changes have affected people's life. So for instance, we started with demand for green skills. We looked at LinkedIn data, at jobs advertised in LinkedIn. So these tend to be sort of higher skilled jobs. And we asked what share of jobs offered on LinkedIn required green skills. And as you see that in the blue line, which shows advanced economies, we saw doubling in the share of ads asking for green skills. While in the EBRD regions, which are mostly new EU member states, the share of jobs asking for green skills went up from 9 to 14%. So much lower demand, much lower change. Another way you can look at the same question is to look at labor force surveys. So here, these are 20 years of labor force surveys in the new EU member states. We looked at people who moved out of the brown sector. So these are the sort of highly emitting sectors. And we asked what happened to those people. Well, part of the slide disappeared, but the big blue area shows that half of the people who left a brown sector moved into unemployment. A fifth moved into retirement. And this green, relatively small area shows that over that 20-year period, only 16% of people who left a brown sector found a job in a green sector. Green sector being a sector that's not intensive in CO2 emissions. And that's a much lower share than in advanced economies, where about a quarter of people who left a brown sector moved into the green sector. Another way of looking at the same question is to take the perspective of local labor markets. So we looked at 11 by 11 kilometer grid. We have data on emissions in those areas, and we can approximate what share of jobs in each of those 11 kilometer by kilometer areas is in highly CO2 intensive industries, and therefore adjustment will be needed. And you see lots of dots in Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary. The red dots show that between 15 and 20% of employment are in those highly CO2 emitting industries, and therefore change will be needed. So that just these three charts just illustrate the scale of the challenge. Now, let me move on to housing. If you look at this left-hand side graph, it shows you that energy use per capita in the housing sector, so this is the brown part of the bar, is lower in EBRD regions than in advanced economies. But when it comes to CO2 emissions per capita associated with residential heating or household appliances, it is on par with the West. And that is because household appliances in emerging countries tend to be less efficient. What we also see is that insulation of housing is lesser in emerging markets, that metering is less prevalent, that energy mix is one of the reasons why CO2 emissions in broadly defined European neighborhood tend to be higher in the residential sector. So where is there scope for adjustment? Well, a lot of unmetered energy is used to heat people's houses. This graph shows you, the bars show you that, for instance, in many of the Eastern European EU member states, half of the households don't have meters when it on heating. So there's a lot that could be done. Similarly, double glazed windows are popular, but they are not universal. So this is another margin of adjustment where progress can be made in terms of green transition. Now, let me move on to people's views, which is, I think, what our discussion will focus on. We conducted household surveys in 38 countries, 1,000 households in each. Survey took place in 2022. In each country, the sample is meant to be representative. And the good news is that 3/4 of respondents admit or believe that climate change is real. Right? So let me blow up this graph for you. On the top of this graph, when you see green fields, green areas mean a higher percentage of respondents giving an affirmative answer. Then it moves to yellow and red. Very red means for about 1/4 of respondents saying yes. So we ask, is climate change real? Is it going to seriously affect you, today's children? And on average, 3/4 of people say yes. In pretty much every country, Lithuania is a bit of an exception, more than 50% of respondents believe that climate change is real. When it comes to questions about concerns about pollution, environment, extreme weather, again, people tend to be concerned. Where you see red squares is when we pose a question in terms of an economic trade-off. Should government prioritize environment over jobs? Are you willing to pay more taxes so that governments could finance climate change? Here, the enthusiasm on the part of the respondents is much lower, and a much smaller share of respondents says yes, and we need to prioritize environment even if it involves some economic trade-off. So what we did with the data is we split people into 3 groups. Supporters, so those who say climate change is real and they are willing to contribute in terms of higher taxes. Skeptics, those who live in denial, who say climate change is not going to affect me or today's generation of children. And then the disengaged. The disengaged believe that climate change is real and matters, but they are unwilling to pay. They are unwilling to pay higher taxes. They are unwilling to accept the economic trade-off. And when we graph the distribution of households by country, you see that in many countries, skeptics and the disengaged account for more than half of the respondents. And in many countries, they are hovering around half. And what's perhaps not what you expected is that in the EU member states, so the Eastern European EU member states are at the top of this graph. These are countries where people see green transition progressing. They know that its impact on their lives is imminent. That's where we see more skeptics. While in countries like Mongolia, Kyrgyz Republic, they are at the bottom of the graph. The implications of climate policies for people's lives are not yet visible. They don't seem imminent. Now, is Eastern Europe different? Well, not very different, because Germany is on top of this graph. So you see very similar views in Germany. Now, are the disengaged rational? It seems that they are rational. Why? Because these are people who do not have university education, so making a career change, retraining, may be more difficult for them. These are people who are in the bottom half of the income distribution, so these are people for whom changing jobs and the upheaval associated with them may be more risky because they don't have savings cushion. And actually, interestingly, women tend to be disengaged, more disengaged, because greener jobs tend to favor men because they are often require STEM skills, and women are less likely to be represented in those fields. So finally, I don't want to sound very pessimistic, so let me finish on a more optimistic note and show that in the countries where the EBRD operates, we have seen an increase in life satisfaction. But again, these figures also provide a warning. Germany, which is on the right-hand side of this graph, saw a decline in life satisfaction relative to 2016. We also see similar patterns in Lithuania, Latvia, no change in Poland. These are countries that were more affected by the war, by the geographic proximity, and also the Baltic states were the places where households immediately felt the impact of higher energy prices because of the way energy prices are reflected in bills faced by households. Another optimistic message is that people, according to our surveys, in their own view, people feel healthier in emerging Europe than they did before. So, to close, the good news is that people in emerging markets where my institution operates seem to be happier, healthier, more prosperous. These countries, the post-communist countries, used to exhibit a happiness gap. Essentially, even if you took into account GDP per capita and household income, post-communist countries used to be more gloomy. People tended to be less satisfied with life. That happiness deficit disappeared in 2016, so that's good news. The bad news is that even though 3/4 of citizens are concerned about climate change, many fewer are prepared to pay for environmental policies. And if there is one thing we at the EBRD learned over 30 years of transition, it is that unless reforms have a broad-based support, they are not going to last. So the success of green transition will depend on capturing the hearts and minds of the people.
Thank you very much, Beata. So you finished there with the fundamental question, how to maintain political support for a decades-long transition in which the range of different changes that will happen across society and the economies will be felt by everyone, but at different times and perhaps a bit unpredictably as well. So I'm very glad that we now have a range of researchers who will be able to talk about their own work, both qualitative and quantitative research into this question. Some of which will, I think, contrast with particularly the Central and East European region that you were referring to so much there, Beata. Some of which where we'll see, I think, some correlations. I noticed Germany is a much more of an outlier in your data than I had expected, and Lithuania more so, but Germany, that's very interesting. And that's, in fact, where we might start, because Jan Eichhorn here, professor at Edinburgh University and also director of the DPART think tank, has done some very interesting recent work on Germany, using focus groups. So good to compare survey results with focus groups methodology as well. And that follows on from other work he's done on generational differences in Europeans' willingness to take different kinds of climate action, and other work he's done about the European Parliament elections and attitudes towards climate in that. So Jan, would you like to give us a view? I think you need the clicker.
Yeah.
For your slides. Okay.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I'm just waiting for the slides to come back up. Apologies, Catherine. There we go. Just to give you a quick insight into some of the points, and they follow on directly, I think, from the issues that we've looked. To think about the imperative of why we need to understand publics better, not just in their behavior, but also in terms of their attitudes and understandings. Fundamentally, as we've shown in the big study that we did 3.5 years ago, we see that most people across Europe expect governments in their country and the EU to take quite strong action on climate. That is partially because they see more responsibility with them than with themselves, and we'll talk about that and motivations to act. But there's a second reason that we've recently seen in focus groups, and that is that a lot of people also feel, maybe legitimately, overwhelmed, frankly, and don't feel they understand what's going on. They don't feel that things are being developed together with them, but they are being told to do many, many things which sometimes seem contradictory. So the state is not just seen as someone to take on responsibility, but also to give guidance. I will. There we go. The important bit is that we see significant socio-demographic differences within this. Younger people tend to have a greater desire for transitions and greater change, but it's not all socio-demography. Each group of society has quite a lot of variation within, and there's difference between countries. Here's something from a report that we did where we contrasted this. For example, how much are young people compared to other population groups willing to take collective action on climate? And what was interesting that in the US, we don't see a significant age divide. In the US, actually, older people who identify as left-leaning were more likely to engage. Those were people who were involved in the civil rights movement, for example. The second dimension is fundamentally material, so something we heard in the earlier talk as well. So even in Germany, where you see younger people more willing to take action, when we actually divide where they live, if those young people live in cities, they want strong action on climate, but they're also, in some instances, quite terrified by what that means for their housing costs, for example, in cities where already housing prices are very high. And actually, younger people in the countryside are more willing to accept infrastructure measures that might affect them. So there is a fundamental variation between places, and we need to take that material dimension into account. I'm going to try to move on. It worked. Fantastic. The other thing that we see is something about knowledge. How much do people understand it? Now, as we've heard, there's very little climate denialism. That's the good news. The bad news is there's still a lot of attribution and impact skepticism. So it's not just the impact skepticism we've heard about, but also a lot of people not correctly identifying that climate change is nearly entirely human-made. So in our survey, what you see is here on the left for each of the country, the people who correctly identified this. But from the middle to the right, at least a large minority in each country that says climate change is roughly equally human and nature-made. That is not just kind of an academic thing, it correlates very strongly with people's policy preferences and willingness to act. That lack of basic knowledge of what climate change is attributable to connects strongly with what people want to see and are willing to do in terms of those transformations. And there's a big gap still in that knowledge. And that gap gets exploited fundamentally by populist and particular far-right discourses, something we see in Germany at the moment, which might explain some of those unpleasant figures we've seen a moment ago. When we've recently conducted focus groups, that's from a new project we're doing at the moment that isn't published yet, what we've seen is a fundamental basically disbelief or doubt about what the state's capacity to act is at all. Now, people start very often in terms of their concerns from real material differences. They talk about their local community, what problems they see. But then what was quite shocking to us compared to focus groups we did less than a year ago, tropes from the far right are taken up by centrist voters, Christian Democrat, social democratic voters. Tropes like fatalism, we can't do anything because China and India pollute more. As an individual, I can't do much. But even worse so, a belief that the elite, so to speak, doesn't reflect their views. The big problem is what happens then when this discourse has become, as we've seen, also taken up by more centrist politicians, the scapegoating from the far right is taken over, and suddenly, in particular, migration communities get blamed for those changes. And that is when we talk about sustainability of attitudes, one of the biggest problems that we're probably seeing, because there isn't a strong response at the moment from the centrist political actors in Germany. And that brings me to the final slide. That material dimension is, as I said, quite essential in people's attitudes profiles. Now, Germany, to the frustration of many in Europe, obviously focuses at the moment on fiscal consolidation when it could invest more in public infrastructure. Now, this is sometimes claimed to be because people effectively really care about debt reduction. And a lot of quick polling shows this. The problem is 60% when asked, should the German government reduce debt, say yes to this. If we reframe the question in a survey and ask people, should the German government borrow money to invest in infrastructure, schools and education, 60% say yes to that. 40% answer yes to both questions, and you'll be guessing right, it's mostly voters of the Christian Democrats and Social Democrats, those centrist voters who care about those material issues, feel that they're not being addressed, notice deterioration of local services, and start scapegoating and blaming and detracting from climate debates because basically they see this discourse taken up by the far right. And that is why we need to connect the political discussion very closely to the political economy discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jan. Really super, and a very interesting range of research using both qualitative and quantitative methods there. So I really encourage all of you also to look into these studies in more detail. You can find them on the DPART website. We're going to have another 3 presentations and then a little bit of discussion between the panelists, and then I'll come to questions from the audience. You can already start thinking about your question, however, now, and you can put it up on Slido with the hashtag transitions. So just go into Slido, you can easily find it online, and put in hashtag transitions. And also if you're in the room, you can ask your question that way. Might be quicker than waiting to be seen here. So we're going to move on now to the work of Catherine Fieschi, who's joining us online. She's at the European University Institute, and she's an academic expert on the far right, has worked a great deal on radical right politics. She wrote a very interesting book recently called Populocracy. She's been doing work on the outlook for the European Parliament elections coming up in June. But she's also been working for quite a few years now on the link between populism and climate delay or detraction. So she did a very interesting project called Green Wedge about the risk of and early signs of populists starting to take up climate as a new issue with which to bash elites, as Jan was pointing out, but also to kind of replace migration when it was no longer delivering, but also to link to migration. Another point that Jan made as well. So there are a number of elements in what Jan was presenting, which I think are also present in Catherine's research. So we're looking forward to what you have to say, Catherine, both on that previous research, but also what you've been doing recently on the Parliament elections.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Heather. And apologies that I can't be with you today in any other way but online. So as I was listening to Beate and Jan, I decided to sort of flip around a little bit what I was going to say and actually start at the end, because where Jan left off on Germany in particular is some of the work that I've been doing on France, and I think it's quite complementary and possibly quite useful for our discussions here today. So one of the things that I, as Heather mentioned, I've been looking at the links between far right parties, populist parties, and climate policy. And several years ago, when this was only really a weak signal on the European political landscapes, and particularly during the COVID moment, where there was a kind of a great swell of optimism that COVID would be, in a sense, the great ushering of everyone's conversion to climate policy. It's true that myself and some other colleagues, started looking at these weak signals where we could detect an uptake by some political actors of some ideological and climate positions that were relatively new in Europe. And in the past year or so, I've been working with a French colleague on the links between ideological positioning and people's climate policy attitudes. And so there's a few things that I think are interesting from the point of view of this discussion. One is how much things have changed and how quickly in the past few years in Europe. It's interesting to note that even a few years ago, there was no real climate skeptical political offer, certainly no climate denialist offer, but no climate skeptical or climate relativist offer. Now we know that we have populists and far-right parties who are very much climate skeptical and climate relativist. It's not terribly surprising. There are many arguments about the fact that, some of which I've made myself, about the fact that the environment and climate policy encompasses a range of issues that are technocratic, with decisions being made by elites, that can be framed as taking a disproportionate toll on ordinary people. And in many ways, they mirror the kind of discourse that had emerged, or that these parties had made emerge around immigration. So climate was going to be the next wedge issue, as we called it. So we're not terribly surprised about that, but it is worth noting how much change there's been in quite a short time. And as Jan noted, the fact that there is no or little consensus on the origins of climate change is something that is extremely predictive of where people fall on this on the spectrum in terms of their being amenable to climate policy. In France, for example, in some of the research that I've recently done, 24% of French people surveyed stated that they thought climate change was the result of natural cycles. One of the things that appears very clearly in the French case that I think is interesting is that there is really a very clear left-right divide. It's a question of intensity. The more on the left somebody places themselves, the more they take climate policy seriously, the more amenable they are to explanations that climate is a consequence of human activity. The more to the right they place themselves, and the less convinced they are by these statements. I think what's really important for us is, as Jan has also highlighted, is that it's not just the far right or the populist right. The populist clusters of citizens that we've been working with, quantitatively, qualitatively, tend to believe more in conspiracies, and conspiracies in particular by elites. They reject the diktats of Brussels, they reject the experts of the IPCC, and they are very much driven by this rejection of elites that leads them into climate conspiracy stances. But the fact is that for most people, certainly in France, who fall on the right, even the center right of the political spectrum, they also tend to be critical of climate policy because they really are people whose preferences we've mapped as being very much driven by a need for predictability, for order. So statements like the ones that we tend to make, like every aspect of our lives will have to change, actually make them recoil. So I think that just to finish on this part, across all of the groups, what's interesting is that the sentiment that sacrifices are being imposed on people and not on elites is shared. So despite this very clear left-right divide, if there is one sentiment that is shared across the spectrum, is that that climate policy imposes sacrifices on people and not enough on elites. And I think that this is important for us because in terms of framing, I think it suggests two things. One is that even measures that are considered to be only symbolic, for example, banning the use or taxing enormously the use of private jets, would go some of the way toward addressing that sense of an uneven sacrifice. I think that if we're going to have to, if we're going to be able to prove the legitimacy and to take the hearts and minds with us, I think that some of these measures, however symbolic in terms of their impact, are actually quite important. The second thing that I think is important is that any more talk of day-to-day sacrifices in the lives of everyday ordinary people is likely to be enormously counterproductive. I take the French the French framing last year during the winter of energy sobriety. Even though I think that the French population rallied to the cause of saving energy, particularly in the context of not just the energy transition, but the energy transition as a consequence of the war against Ukraine. I do think that what we've measured is that the talk of day-to-day sacrifices is extremely unproductive. I think two last points before I end. One is that it's not all bad news, because one of the things that we've measured is that, given what's at play here, whether it's this idea of sacrifices needing to be made by elites, or the need for order and predictability, aside from the conspiracy theories, it's not just bad news because it's not just an economic trade-off. There is plenty else to valorize and to play on that I think will get people on board, and I'm happy to discuss that. I think, though, just to conclude on my part, which I think it is important to say this in this meeting, given that we're talking about behavior change. Everything that I've said, I think many governments and certainly most political parties are well aware of at the moment, which is why we're seeing, the biggest behavior change we need right now is in June, is make sure that we have the right kind of electoral behavior change in the European elections. We're on track for an EU election where not only do profoundly climate skeptical parties stand to do well, but where the mainstream right stands to maintain its standing by leaning further to the right. And the meetings that are about to take place, I think, in Bucharest, the EPP meetings tomorrow and Thursday, are a really good indication of the center right really toughening its stance against climate policy. And I think that this will have massive consequences on member state appetites to actually implement or whatever comes out or has already come out of European institutions and the European Commission in particular. So I think that we need to keep in mind what's at stake here in the European elections, and the fact that everything that we're raising here, I think, is going to come. It's going to be loud and clear in terms of the results that we see in June. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting points, particularly with regard to the upcoming elections. So I'm going to move on now, because I'm conscious that time is running, to Sari Lane, who's come all the way from Helsinki to join us. Thank you very much for doing that. And who's worked at Sitra, the Finnish innovation research agency, for, I think, 7 years, doing a lot of empirical research on what motivates people, particularly how preferences have changed in Finland over the past years, but also looking at other countries. So she's going to talk to us about nature and daily living.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. Yeah, so last 7 years we have done the work in Finland to engage people to live more sustainably. When we started, this slide maybe said people think sustainability sucks, and in 7 years we have added some and still, because there has been a change. We really think that the communication about the sustainable lifestyle has really not resonated. We always talked about black and white. You need to be vegan or you're not. Even though those are argued, are you a real vegan or not? You need to diminish. You need to live a lesser life. Everything is a struggle, and that's the way that we are not gonna make the change happen. So we have been using in our work a lot of a COMPI model, which is a social science behavior change model, which means that you have to have the capability to make the change, you have to have the opportunity to make the change, but you also need to have the motivation. And we usually focus on capability and opportunity. So there is kind of like, you know how to ride a bike, and there is a bike lane, please do so. But we don't think that what actually motivates you to try. And we have done some work about the motivation factors. So we interviewed a lot of Finnish people. We didn't ask that what motivates you to a sustainable lifestyle, but what motivates in your everyday life. And we found these uniting, motivating factors. So we value the family. We like to have a little everyday choice. We need to live independent life. So we are not happy if somebody tells us that you need to change. So let's not use that. Like you can see, the environmental friendliness is there, but it's really a faded little bubble. We have a small smart actions for the environment, which are the easy ones, like recycling or avoiding food waste. But really, other motivations are more coherent there. And for example, we had just a survey where 83% of Finns said that they would conserve the nature better if it would benefit their health. So health is a big motivation. And we also have divided Finns in 7 motivation profiles. And as you can see, they differ by how sustainable the lifestyle is, and does the sustainability actually be the motivator, or is it just a byproduct? And I always like to point out this thrifty planner, the light blue here, which is the profile that actually is living pretty sustainably, but it's not doing it because of sustainability at all. And it's not kind of like that profile is poor or something that they don't have money, but they really want to hack their everyday. So they want to be living minimalistic. They use the Excel. That gives them a sense of safety. They can control the life. So this is the things that we need to do. We need to use the other motivations to move us all to the right side, because we are in a hurry, but eventually in the long run, move us to the top right. So first to the right, and then maybe our values or identities change in a way when we notice that this is not so bad, this is actually pretty good. We still can live a good satisfaction in our life. One of the tools that we have used in Finland and how we have used the motivation profiles or the motivations as well is the lifestyle test. So you basically can test your impact on the climate at the moment. We are working on a nature level as well. And it gives you basically a carbon footprint, but then there's also, there used to be a funny profile which went viral because people were sharing it, we're bringing it back. But this is a new version where you can also make a plan for how you want to reduce your impact. So it's really how you want to reduce your impact. It's not that you are told to do so. There's 100 different actions that you can choose from, and everyone can choose their way of reducing the impact. Those people who have done the plan are committing already a 31% of a reduction, so it's doable. But we have also scaled this with the EU Horizon funding to 7 other countries, and we are collecting the data in the same place. So that's going to be the next great thing, is that we can use the data maybe to accelerate the change. We are in the process of having a workshop with the decision makers and building a dashboards for the decision makers, that how would you use this data to make a better decisions for your people. For example, maybe in Lisbon, some of the city parts there, you can see that, okay, they want really heat pumps. Maybe we can put incentives for the heat pumps because people want them. The data that it collects also that what people don't want to do and why, so we can also kind of look maybe those points. The next thing that we are building at the moment, we are also calculating the consumption-based biodiversity footprint for Finns. We heard that it's maybe a first time globally. And that's maybe because we've been all the time talking about the climate impact and climate action. And the climate, let's be frank here, is emotionally for us pretty hard to connect with. But nature maybe is easier. So that's the next thing that we are trying to build and try out. That can we build a better emotional connection with the nature world? We are part of the nature, us and other nature, storylines, and build maybe that way more impactful change as well. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sari. Really super. And you can see here the links to those various reports, and I really recommend to take the lifestyle test. I did it a few years ago, and it revealed to me my enormous carbon sin, which is flights. And also, but then what's great about the tool is then it suggests different ways of reducing and also some of the trade-offs you can make in terms of your own personal carbon footprint. So I gave up meat, which meant I could take more flights. Now, I'm not sure that those two things are perfectly correlated, but still, this sense of individual choice and agency is a really key part of the work of Citra, and particularly the role of governments in providing the opportunities and the capability, which has to then match individual motivations, is I think a really key lesson from that. Super interesting. So our final speaker is my colleague Francesco Nicoli, who's a non-resident fellow at Bruegel. He's also a professor of political science at the Politecnico Istituto di Torino, and he's at Ghent University. He's done some very interesting large-scale public opinion correlation work, including a recent study on the income effects of climate policies and people's attitudes towards those that you can find on the Bruegel website. So over to you, Francesco.
Thank you. So actually in November, December 2022, we coordinated a large-scale survey across 5 countries, Italy, France, the Netherlands, Germany, and Spain, representative for the population overall. And we were triggered by the fact that very often public opinion polls give very high levels of support for green policies, but also very low level of supports for raising taxes. How do we make sense of this trade-off? There is only one way of doing it, that is using what we call survey experiments. So we designed batteries of survey experiments, in particular 3 survey experiments, to assess people's attitudes towards energy policies overall, climate change, and how much people support or oppose top-down government regulation on energy. I'm going to talk especially about the first and the last one, not so much about the EU energy policy decisions, but in general, unfortunately, have to bring, or our data bring, a sobering look on what people want. On average, we find that people really like the idea of reducing emissions. They are very supportive of reducing emissions, as long as they don't have to pay for it. The moment they are faced with scenarios where they have to pay for it, support collapses. Especially so when the costs are to be borne by them directly. But even when it's their region, their country, or Europe as a whole that has to pay, not themselves directly, support is seriously lower. Even more so if, in fact, we face them with scenarios where there are monetary gains, even for them personally, from the climate transition. The positive effect of a monetary gain is much lower than the negative effect of a monetary loss, which tells us that designing compensation policies is complicated. People are not really, even if you were to perfectly compensate people for the losses that they obtain or they will suffer from climate transition, people will still not be very supportive. I mean, if you talk with people, they will say, why do I have to pay for this? And even if you give me back money, it requires administrative interactions, it requires additional administrative burden. I lose time on it to, compensate for something I probably am not very responsible for directly. So in general, what we observe is that people are really not willing to pay for this, and if you want them on board, you need to do more than compensating the losses, which is politically a time bomb, I think. Then moving to the final results that we have in a different experiment, we also tested how much individuals are willing to accept a top-down government decision on energy consumption reductions, for instance. And we see that in general, people are, at least in December 2022, which was a very peculiar moment due to the energy crisis, people were quite okay with the idea of the government acting in promoting a reduction in consumption, but only if they were the ones having the ultimate decision. So people were fundamentally against mandated consumption reductions. They were quite supportive of other tools. For instance, incentives, for instance, government advertisement that explains to them and their fellow citizens the implications of and the advantages of reducing consumption. But what they don't want is top-down regulation. Where does leave us? I mean, we're heading towards European elections. It's clear that we overestimated the support for the green transition, and I'm afraid we're going to see the electoral, let's say, feedback on that, which possibly will push us to rethink a little bit the way we organize, and probably what the colleagues were saying before, the issue of elites versus the population at large, I think, is crucial. Even symbolic actions, as they were mentioned, make a very strong point for at least an apparent understanding, an apparent vision of a shared responsibility for this, and not just on the population at large.
Thanks very much, Francesco. Super interesting points. And we've now had a range of very interesting findings and, frankly, dilemmas that face policymakers. Here we are at the end of a term of the EU institutions where the EU has set binding climate targets and a climate law, now with targets for 2030, 2040 and 2050. And we're moving into the implementation phase when national governments have to start spending money and also imposing measures on people. And we're hearing from this range of research that the public doesn't like bans and taxes and coercive measures. They're much keener on carrots and incentives. Quite a lot of Germans both want fiscal rectitude, but also want more spending in this direction, as Jan found. And we see also in, just to quote another member state, in France, from the work of Catherine, that the exploitation of this idea of a trade-off between elites and the public it means that people don't want to see costs only imposed on the population at large. They want to make sure that elites are also paying a cost. So these are really important findings to make the political economy of the climate transition more positive. We've heard some really major warnings about the risk that it will turn much more negative in the future rather than positive, and also that the parliament elections could make the EU institutions a less conducive place to continue with major, more radical climate measures, and the need for national governments to lead the way in using the measures that have already been agreed, plus, of course, also the funding and incentives. So we now have a number of questions that have come in on Slido. Well, I encourage the rest of you also to use Slido. The hashtag is transitions. And I think we should start with a couple of questions around how to move into a positive side of this. How to build hope and positive future visions to encourage and speed up the change towards more sustainable lifestyles on an individual level. We can see that policy has moved very far, but we can also see how politics has, in some respects, moved in the opposite direction. So how would it be possible to build more of a positive vision of the future? And please feel free, panelists, when you come in on this, also to comment on the work of the others that you found interesting, because you haven't had a chance to do that yet. Who'd like to start on that? Sorry.
We actually have a project for this, so that's why I was like, yeah, thank you for the question. We have a Future Good Life project where we are actually at the moment of developing imagination tools, visioning tools with a group of people. And the goal is to publish a set of visioning tools for just the average citizen to kind of see themselves in a future where sustainability has happened, everything is good, to build the hope, and also kind of how would you say? I don't know, but just, because we always say that test your impact and choose the actions. We haven't said ever that where it takes you. And if you don't have that in your mind, it really is kind of trying to build the intrinsic motivation through that.
Yeah, so giving people a sense of what daily life would be like.
Yeah.
How will you live? What kind of housing will you have? What kind of work will you have? How will you get around? All this kind of thing. Oh, well, that's great. Citra is doing that work. Jan.
Following up from that, and also what Sari said, I think one of the really important things is link debates about the climate crisis to things people care about in their daily lives. We said this, in the report 3 years ago. Yes, people don't like kind of for the sake of it reductions and rules, but if it is something that they care about anyways, it works. In Germany and France, we saw in 2020, after the big meat scandal in Germany and so on, if you framed a debate as banning mass animal incarceration for meat productions, people supported it. So it was a link between health, quality of food, safety, and climate things. They hated the meat tax idea, but they really, really responded positively to an idea that created issue linkage. The problem is, while that isn't done, the right has been able to do it, and that's where we see those migration things come in. The way it works is people being fearful of a lot of changes, and we've gone through a number of crises, climate being one, and then the scapegoating around migration comes in. It's basically this argument that is made the elites are trying to force all these changes over you. So a lot of it isn't linked like that, but it's that discursive shift because there an issue linkage is made a dangerous one. But finally, I do want to kind of say also, I think, especially when we did work with lower socioeconomic status groups in our focus groups, it's totally understandable that the first reaction of them is when we talk about, will you accept higher taxes, higher things, that they say no because they're terrified. When we asked people to elaborate on this, the most striking example was someone who talked about, well, even the price of oats in the supermarket has increased. That was the one staple food I could rely on feeding my family with. And this is a full-time employed person in Germany. So if I'm in that position that I'm terrified about the price of oats, I'm clearly terrified about any idea that prices might go up.
Yeah, very fundamental issue. Beata.
Some levers to pull, right? So what we've seen over the last 2 decades is growing support for state intervention. So if you ask people, should the state play a greater role in the economy and in the industry? And if you ask people, is it important to live in a democracy? Support for state playing a big role in the economy is actually greater than support for democracy. Moreover, the support for the state has grown over the last 2 decades, even in the post-communist countries, which is somewhat surprising given the history, and it has grown within cohorts. So essentially, people belonging to a particular generation have changed their mind and become more supportive of state intervention. Right? So, and that echoes what we've heard, that people expect the state to do something. Now, what should the state do? Catherine was talking about people wanting order and predictability. People don't want uncertainty, and reforms, structural changes cause uncertainty because you don't know whether you will come up top or whether you will lose. So what we need to do is to reassure people that the state will be there to take care of them. And I think here, the US experience with globalization provides a lesson. Globalization increases the size of the pie, but it creates winners and losers. Right? And winners could compensate losers, but in practice, this does not happen. And because industries exposed to the China shock were geographically concentrated, that created pockets of discontent, pockets of opposition towards globalization. And that was one of the factors that contributed to Trump administration imposing tariffs on China. So I think the lesson we can draw from this is, rather than sweeping some difficult conversations under the carpet, and talking about the green transition that will result in lots of jobs. Yes, there will be lots of jobs in the green future, but between today and that green future, there is the transition period. And people need to be reassured that the state, will take care of them.
Yeah, indeed, particularly the role of the social safety net at the bottom, including in advanced, wealthy economies like Germany, as Jan's been pointing out. And I think, just to refer back, the EBRD did a transition report on inequality in 2015, which of course is a very long time after post-communist transition began, and anger about the increase in inequality as a result of that transition has had very long-lasting impact in politics. So we can learn from the China shock globalization experience, but also post-communist transition experience. So the just transition really matters. I want to just bring in two questions. In fact, we now have three questions from Slido about the responsibility and agency of companies. Should we be focusing mainly on the state and on individuals? What about the private sector? What kind of responsibility do they have, particularly through marketing? And the power of the private sector in shaping consumer preferences, which of course are all about individual behavioral change as well. And also the example effect of if companies get away with unsustainable practices, why should people be making sacrifices in their own lives, especially if they can so little afford it? Would you like to come in on that, Francesco?
Of course. So to be honest, if you ask in a survey, who you think should take care of taking leadership on the climate action, is companies or individuals? Most respondents will say, no, companies first. We haven't tested this, but if you then say, if the companies take action, you have 5% possibility of losing your job because the cost for the company raises. I'm afraid people would then again change their perspectives. So at a societal level, there are issues of inequality and of redistribution, but ultimately there are costs to be borne. And these costs need to be borne by the society as a whole. There is no free meal for real on climate policy. Unfortunately, even when it comes to individual level actions, I think there is only so much we can do with the lifestyle changes. There are actual costs, technological costs, industry level cost that needs to be borne by someone in a society. And if we don't have that conversation at the political level when elections take place, I think we will be once again facing a reckoning at the next electoral cycle.
Especially when we see, for example, continued subsidies to the fossil fuel industry, for fossil fuels in general, and also new industrial policies which are helping firms through the transition, but then individuals are asking, how do I benefit? Catherine, do you have a view on this? You were talking about how in France especially, the idea that elites should also bear part of the costs, as Francesco was just saying, is critical. Is that also about firms?
Yes, it's definitely about firms. There's been great scrutiny on green supply chain, particularly transport logistics, where France doesn't do very well in terms of the European landscape. So I think this is very clearly the case. It's particularly the case in a country like France, because as I've said, the preferences map on quite clearly on a sort of left-right political spectrum divide, which basically means that, particularly all of those people who feel that a toll needs to be borne by the elites more than ordinary people can buy into this. But secondly, we know that this is going to play well with people who are more on the left or the social democratic side, who feel that companies need to put in the work and need to bear these costs. I also think, just to finish on this, that it connects to something that was just evoked in the last question exchange, and that is that I think that one lever that needs to be pulled is the framing around a kind of rebalancing, right? This is about re-equilibrating, rebalancing something that is wildly off kilter. I think that the reason that climate policy became focus of attention during COVID is that we were in a moment where all sorts of disbalances, dysfunctionalities came to a head, and then this ebbed back into normality. But I do think that casting the role of firms and the private sector in this light of a rebalancing of contributions would be extremely useful as a lever to pull.
Of responsibility is helpful in this respect too. Jan, you had a view on this.
Just briefly, from our focus groups in Germany and France as well, one thing, it's one of those things you wouldn't get out of a survey, but when you had people talk about it, most people, except for a few proper libertarians who were there, do not believe that changes by private sector firms themselves will change something fundamentally. They expect the state to act, and they're required. The problem is more and more don't believe the state can act. And this is something we notice. People use very different words and evaluations depending on what sort of private sector actors they talk about. They don't trust large international firms, especially when it feels like they're investors from elsewhere. They do trust the Germany, the classic Mittelstand kind of firm. They trust them quite a lot, actually, to enact things. So actually, when people talk about businesses and so on, they make big differentiations. But, and that is a really, really important point in this, structural understandings of the economy, the level of discussion we have here, nothing we said was complicated to anyone in the room just now about this, go over everyone's head. The French were a bit better at kind of structural criticism than the Germans, maybe that makes sense, but overall, understandings of basically that interplay of economic structures was close to zero. And the moment we brought in financial capital, the role of banks and finance, it went into the negative, and we basically just got fake news stories. It's really something that I don't think we underestimate how poor people's ability to talk about the economy is. And that's really important in terms of communication and the need for having solutions that are not just discursively, not just telling them we'll do stuff about you, but changing things materially in their lived environment. Because otherwise, it nearly doesn't matter what we're saying. Their lived environment needs to be better than it is now.
It sounds like also, given this need for order and predictability that most people have, but especially conservative voters have, the need for perhaps a social contract around the transition to give people a sense of here's where the social safety net will be, here's where the costs will lie, as well as here's where the opportunities will be. We are unfortunately out of time, but Beata, I just want to give you the last word in responding on that.
I just wanted to mention that the fact that people would want action to be taken by firms means that states have another lever to pull through regulation, through emission trading scheme and CBAM. The challenge is that these actions will affect people as consumers in terms of prices and as workers.
So that the costs actually are experienced by people in many different aspects of their lives, in their taxes, in the prices that they pay, and also when they're voting, what kinds of policy options they're presented with. So thank you all very much. It was really super interesting. It was a bit of a skate through an enormous amount of research, but I hope that's also been useful in itself in getting an overview of the complexity of these issues and very interesting recent work that's been done on this. Thanks to all of you contributing online as well as in the room. And you will see more work from Bruegel on this in the future, as well as from Deepart, from Citra, and from the EBRD, and indeed from Catherine at the EUI. Thanks to you all.